r/ask Reddit. What are some one-hit wonders in other fields besides music? In 1969, an unknown Australian male model named George Lazenby won the role of James Bond, probably the most famous and popular on-screen hero in the world at the time. Adjusted for inflation, Goldfinger and Thunderball had both grossed today's equivalent of over $1 billion, taking over from Sean Connery, then one of the biggest movie stars of all time, and starred in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which many Bond fans still regard as one of the best films. He then turned down the contract to star in 7 more Bond films. Feeling the role was just a stepping stone to becoming an even bigger star, he proceeded to never get a single major role in another prominent film ever again. You must have a pretty big ego to see the role of James Bond as a stepping stone. If I was an actor, I would be happy just getting steady work. Plus, I bet they had merchandise and meet and greets and stuff. Just pull a William Shatner and milk that role for all it's worth. Definitely, considering how big James Bond is, especially at the time. What else could be bigger and so steady? I think it was his manager who advised him not to do any more films, as he felt the spy genre would wear thin pretty soon. The guy still has a net worth of $100 million though. James K. Polk wasn't really expected to win the presidency, got in and basically fulfilled all his campaign promises in his first term, which included added a huge amount of territory to the US at the expense of Mexico. Because he achieved everything he wanted to, he didn't run again. Is that a one-hit wonder or a badass that doesn't even need a second hit? Hard to tell, because he died 3 months after his presidency ended. Well, as I understand it, he campaigned on the platform of one term. He promised that he wanted change, not power, so he would not run for a second term and get all his shit done in the first 4 years. The political scene was also much different then. Harper Lee, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird and essentially nothing else. Well, she wrote Go Set a Watchman too, but we don't talk about that. I still don't believe she ever meant for that book to be published. She wrote it first, and her editor said this particular flashback is good. Focus more on this as the rest isn't as interesting or something. Basically saying the childhood of Scout was good, the rest wasn't. After these notes, out comes TKM. In goes Watchman into a drawer never to be seen again. Fair warning, you can probably put on tinfoil for this. There's a reason she died so soon after GSAW came out. It was a failed effort and she had no desire for it to see the light. She was barely holding it together at its release and died soon after. She very likely was tricked into signing something and out comes GSAW. I just don't believe after her success she would wait decades to release the book that is objectively inferior and was written before Mockingbird. She knew TKM was better. She knew Watchmen wasn't really good, even ignoring comparisons to TKM. And yet magically her failed novel releases less than a year before her death. Just no way. Buster Douglas, almost literally, was supposed to be a tomato can, but knocks Mike Tyson out for his first defeat. And this when Tyson was supposed to be at the top of his game. Then, nothing else. Really. First person I thought of, not many bigger upsets in boxing history, if any. What's a tomato can? A fighter that should be easy to beat. Peter Ostrom played Charlie in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, then left acting. Now he's a veterinarian near here. Good for him. I swear like 99% of child actors end up ducked up in some way. The Heimlich maneuver. Dr. Heimlich tried to invent a bunch of other maneuvers that didn't become nearly as popular, many of which were actually incredibly dangerous. For the record, nowadays the Red Cross recommends 5 hard slaps on the back if someone is choking, and only if that doesn't work should you resort to the Heimlich. Radiolab did a great episode on it where they talked to the doc himself. Timmy Smith, a running back for the Washington Redskins. He ran for 204 yards in Super Bowl 22. This is still the most ever rushing yards in a Super Bowl. Played 3 seasons and never had more than 470 yards rushing in a season, and after his career was arrested on cocaine distribution charges. But boy, that one game on the game's biggest stage. Not as egregious, but every Pats fan knows who Jonas Gray was. Signed off the practice squad. Ran 200 yards against the Colts. Showed up late for practice. Got benched for most of the rest of the season. And never played again. Belichick hates running backs. There has to be more to this story. Was he just never showing up to practice on time? My football one was gonna be David Tyree and the helmet catch. Over the course of his career, regular season and playoffs combined, he had 58 receptions, 697 yards, and 5 TDs. And yet he's the star of one of the most iconic plays in NFL history. Anastasia Miskina, 2004 French Open Grand Slam Women's Champion, never won another slam or reached another slam semi-final, retired 3 years later. Gaston Gaudio, 2004 French Open Grand Slam Men's Champion. He had never reached further than third round before the win and never reached further than third round after the win. Yik yak. And then simultaneously ducked it up. If they'd never actually changed it from the original release, or at least a very early version, it'd probably still be popular. I think the only decent update they made was assigning you a random symbol whenever you commented on something, so that you could identify who was who in the comments without sacrificing the anonymity. As soon as they added photos, made us have usernames and all that crap, it died overnight. At least around me it did. DeLorean Motor Company made one model of car that became iconic, then went bankrupt. It went bankrupt before it became iconic, arguably making them an unhit wonder in that case. I think it's great culturally that this happened. Imagine how cheesy BTTF would feel if the car was a Dodge Charger, or another model you can still get today. It would feel like an advertisement, and Dodge would probably still be riding the popularity of it. Instead, DeLorean might as well be made specifically for the movie, since it doesn't exist anywhere outside of it. Yes, but the iconography came after the company failed. They made a DeLorean, it bombed, the company folded, then the makers of Back to the Future chose that car to make the time machine out of it. Heck, in Back to the Future, the fact that it is a DeLorean is meant to be a joke because at the time the car had the reputation for being a piece of shit. The success of the movies, however, have effectively buried that reputation, and now all anyone thinks of when they think of DeLorean is Back to the Future. Alexei Pajitnov, who designed and programmed Tetris. He got ripped off by Nintendo and others and only started to get money from Tetris in 1996. He couldn't afford to invest in new projects. Michael Cimino directs the movie The Deer Hunter, wins Oscar, next makes Heaven's Gate, blew up a horse, wasted millions of dollars, bankrupted the studio. Now consider one of the worst films ever, and he never made a major picture again. What do you mean he blew up a horse? He put dynamite on a horse and blew it. What else were you thinking of? The director's cut of Heaven's Gate is pretty good. It's one of a few films from around that time screwed by studio interference. I've also seen the director's cut. It's not a masterpiece, but the film certainly doesn't deserve its reputation. Critics knew how much the film had cost and came with knives out attempting to outdo each other's quips once it started getting bad reviews. I'll take a film that reached full greatness and failed over a middling effort every time. Leicester City, probably, going from finishing 14th after being dead last in the league at Christmas in 14/15 to winning the 15/16 Premier League, then falling to a 12th place finish in 16/17 seems like a one-hit wonder to me. The best argument against them would be whether being a goal away from a Champions League semi-final berth is enough to overlook their domestic form in 16/17. Hell of a story either way. A good choice. That title run was absolutely insane. Literally all worlds colliding for them. Last year was troubling at times, but they still managed a decent finish in the Prem. So far this year they've been disappointing a bit, but I think they are a good team that has the talent and tools to stabilize into a consistent top 10, at worst top 12 team in the Prem, which is far better than what they were before even their shock run. The person that copyrighted the happy birthday song and was just a random person looking to get rich fast. And it worked. Alexander Ivanov, a painter who spent 20 years, almost his entire adult life after graduation, on the appearance of Christ before the people. Princip, the 19-year who assassinated the Archduke of Austria and started World War I. He died 3 years later in prison. But damn, what a legacy. Man, I'm 23 and I still haven't started a single world war. Richard Kelly, director of Donnie Darko, Eduardo Sanchez and Daniel Myrick, directors of the Blair Witch Project. I worked at a pawn shop that sold a shitload of movies back in '08. We had a very large selection of VHS tapes. One day the boss decided we weren't going to carry them anymore. They took up too much space and we didn't make very much profit off of them. So we stopped accepting them altogether and lowered the flat rate price from $1 each to $1.25 each. We sold them by the dozens for a few months until eventually we ended up with just 2 movies left but about 300 copies of each. They were Jurassic Park and the Blair Witch Project. A whole shelf packed 3 deep with just copies of these 2 movies. It took 2 years to sell them all for $0.05 each. I can only assume it's because everyone already had Jurassic Park on DVD VHS. Eternal Darkness. Sanity's Requiem. Holy shit, what a good game. It's unique. To this day I have never played anything quite like it. I have all sorts of fun stories about getting my hands on a disc that worked, involving discs snapped in half and scotch taped together, toothpaste, and giving a GameStop clerk a really weird day, and it was duckin' worth it. The company sort of died. The creator turned out to be an egotistical a-hole. They tried to make a sort of sequel on Kickstarter and cokied it up, and we'll probably never see another game like it, but man, it was interesting. Was that the one on GameCube that took place over ages as different people through history got possessed by some demon? I had been trying to remember what the hell that was called. It had the insanity meter, and the game would start to mess with your mind when the meter filled. That was messed up. The best bit was when it faked a hard crash and reboot of the console. Then when it loaded back in, all your save games were gone. Then it flashed back into the game, right where you left off. As a fellow game developer, that level of commitment to trolling players really blew my mind. Most consoles wouldn't allow that through certification these days. Josh Trank directed Chronicle, a fun little found footage movie that got a lot of positive buzz. Then went on to direct the latest Fantastic Four movie, which was purportedly so terrible the studio had to try to salvage it into something barely watchable. Reports of his behavior on set sank a previously promising career. He lost his spot directing one of the Star Wars films coming up. Doubt we'll see much of him anymore. To be fair, apparently the other side of the story was that Trank's initial vision for F4 was to have a darker type of movie where the characters' mutations were done in a body horror Cronenberg type of style. But eventually, the studio got cold feet and intervened in order to make it more mainstream. The reports of his shitty on-set behavior do seem to be real, and if so it is inexcusable. But a Shollick director aside, it would have been interesting to see what all the noise was about. Even if the film turned out to be bad, at least it might have been different to the million cookie cutter superhero movies we get every year. Takeuchi Naoko wrote the original Sailor Moon manga from 1991 to 1997, which became a massive international manga anime franchise, becoming one of the most recognizable manga anime of all time. She has written absolutely nothing of note since. Similarly, Watsuki Nobuhiro wrote the immensely popular Rurouni Kenshin from 1994 to 1999, and while he did produce a couple other manga that had at least some success, nothing compared to the scale of popularity that Rurouni Kenshin had. Russ Hanneman. The guy put radio on the internet. Next thing you know, he IPOs. Stock triples in a day and AOL gobbles it up. All of a sudden, he's 22 years young and worth $1.2 billion. Now a couple decades later, he's worth 1.4. You do the math. He made $200 million more than you in the last 20 years. The only good Starship Troopers is the first one. It's the only one directed by Paul Verhoeven, who is definitely not a one-hit wonder. Niantic and the first 3 weeks of Pokemon Go. S.E. Hinton is mostly known for The Outsiders, which he wrote in high school. Another recent example for books could be Christopher Paolini with the Aragorn books. I feel like most YA novel franchise author can have this said about them though. Joseph Heller wrote Catch-22, which was an amazingly funny critique of war. Did eventually write a sequel, but it wasn't well received. I remember hearing an anecdote about Heller. A friend noted that he hadn't written anything as good as Catch-22 since it came out. Heller replied, well, has anyone? Herman Melville is actually an interesting version of this. version because he was successful in his time with his pre-Moby Dong work. However, he became inspired by and potentially enamored with Nathaniel Hawthorne. Hawthorne challenged and pushed Melville on a literary front, and the result was Moby Dong, which was so ahead of its time that it essentially sunk Melville's career since it was such a drastic departure from his previous successful work. Even Hawthorne abandoned support and acknowledgement of Melville over time, which had to have burned. It wasn't until much later, after his death, that Moby Dong was recognized as a masterpiece, and it's really the only thing known by him widely, excepting of course Bartleby, the Scrivener, which had an awesome little film with Crispin Glover. So, historical one-hit wonder, even though he was successful in his time until the thing that made him more historically relevant. O.J. Simpson. He was awesome in Naked Gun but never made anything good after that. Sad. I heard that he dabbled in other activities. Scott Cawthon is essentially known for just Five Nights at Freddy's. Considering how he was borderline suicidal and working at a dollar store before making that game, I doubt he'd care if it was a one-hit wonder. The FNAF franchise turned out to be a huge hit, and he made a major name for himself. Unless he decides to get into filmmaking or something, I doubt there's much else he should try to do. The black guy from The Blind Side who played Michael. There was so much talk of him being the next big thing in Hollywood, but then he just up and disappeared. He was in an episode of Law and Order, SVU a year later. He disappeared largely because he can't act. Troy Duffy never did anything in film other than the 2 Boondock Saints movies. Gary Pratt, a bit niche for Reddit, but he's a cricketer who came into the field as a substitute for England at one of the pivotal moments of one of the best ever series of cricket, the 2005 Ashes. Somehow he got the Australian captain, Ricky Ponting, run out. He never even came close to playing for England as a proper player, and remains an obscure cult hero. Whoa, you made it to the end? You're a ducking beast. I'll cut you a deal. Smash like and subscribe for more curated content, bruh. It's free and that's a great price.